Check.
Hello, everyone. Okay, I think it's working. So I've been pretty much he told you everything there is to know about me, but I still wanted to introduce myself. And just like he said, wait. Just like he said, I'm originally from Greece. I live in Boston now, but I grew up in Greece, and specifically in the island of Lesbos, which technically makes me geographically lesbian. That's why I told him he spoiled my joke there, because, like, yeah, I had this in my slides. In other news, I love open source. I've started a lot of open source projects. Maybe some of you have used my work. I'm an invited expert in the CSS working group. There's me, right next to Chris, who is speaking last today. So if you have any questions about how CSS standards work, like, feel free to ask me. That's fine as well. It doesn't have to do anything with the talk necessarily. I've written a book. It's called CSS Secrets. It's translated in a few languages, unfortunately not Ukrainian. And my day job is doing research at MIT as part of the Haystack group. My research is about making web programming easier. Whoa, what? Someone should do some research on making projections easier. Okay, I have no idea what's going on here. Okay. Okay, I'll continue. My day job is about making web programming easier. I'm doing research in that. And I'm working on a language called Mavo, which aims to make it possible to create entire web applications by just writing HTML and CSS, no backends, no JavaScript, no programming. Just people who can write HTML and CSS will be able to make entire web applications. And it's an open source project, so you can already use it. So, today, I wanted to talk not just about CSS, but also about SVG, and more specifically, the intersection of the two. There's a lot of cool demos out there on the web about how to use SVG to make really cool interactive visualizations and icons and things like that, which are really, really cool. But I also find that you can use SVG in certain ways to enhance what CSS can do, to cover CSS's gaps, because there are certain things that CSS cannot dream of doing today, and SVG makes them possible very easily. So before I dive into the specific things I wanted to share with you today, I wanted to talk a little bit about scaling and sizing with SVG. First off, how many of you have written SVG markup? Excellent. About half. I love this. And how many of you know how ViewBox works? A lot fewer. Okay. So because I'm going to be using different ways of scaling SVGs throughout the talk, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So here I have an embedded SVG in HTML, which is why I'm just using an SVG element, no XMLNS, because it's right in my HTML. And I've given it a width and height and no view box. So it's 300 by 200 pixels. And I have a rectangle of 100% width and height, which fills the entire area. Notice that my SVG has a background of yellow, but you don't actually see it because this yellow-green rectangle fills the entire area. And I also have a rectangle with a width and height of 100, which in this case is 100 pixels. And you can see that if I change its dimensions to 300 by 200, then it fills the entire area because in this case it's actually pixels. However, let's go back to something smaller first. For example, 50. If I use a view box, so the view box does two things. It defines a coordinate system for the SVG, and it also defines an aspect ratio. So here, my rectangle that was 50 by 50 now occupies 1/4 of the rectangle, because now 50 by 50 is not pixels anymore. The view box defined the coordinate system. So these units are now relative to that coordinate system. And also, the view box defined an aspect ratio. Now my aspect ratio is square. So because my dimensions define a rectangle that is not square, I can actually see the SVG behind it that is yellow. And to further dissipate the idea that the view box might have something to do with pixels, it has nothing to do with pixels. I could even have a view box that is like this, and then make this 0.5, and I get the same result. Once I have a view box, any number inside the SVG that doesn't have a unit or a percent is relative to the view box. And what happens if I don't have dimensions? So if I don't have one of the dimensions, for example, height, then it's calculated based on the aspect ratio that the view box defined. If I'm missing width, same thing, the width is calculated based on the aspect ratio I have. If I don't define either a width or a height, then the SVG stretches to accommodate the entire available area. Also, I mentioned that the view box does two things. It defines a coordinate space and an aspect ratio. In some cases, you may not want that, so you can use preserve aspect ratio none, and then it fills the entire space. However, now, your units are not rectangular necessarily. Even though this looks like a square, it has the same width and height, it's actually a rectangle, which can be quite a problem in some cases. For example, let's say you have some text, and let's give it a font size of 0.3 maybe. Is it like that? Oh, there it is. I guess it was over the black rectangle. Yes. So as you can see, actually, it's easier to see with an emoji. You can see now it's all stretched. So usually, in most cases, we don't actually want preserve aspect ratio none because it stretches graphics in a way we don't want. And which is why you're not going to really need to see this throughout the talk. I just thought I would mention it. So this is all I really want you to know so that we can move on to more interesting things. Everything else I think you can pick up along the way. So to recap, viewbox defines the coordinate system and the aspect ratio unless you use preserve aspect ratio equals none. And if you don't use a width and height, it makes the SVG scale to fill the entire area. So the first thing I wanted to share is using characters as images. I often wanted to use a glyph from a font or an emoji or something like that as an actual image in my CSS. And the way I did it was I would have to open Photoshop and use the text tool and then export it to PNG or something and then use it in my CSS. And if I wanted to change something, I would have to make the entire round trip again. Until eventually, at some point, I realized I didn't have to do that. So how does that work? First off, I guess you've all seen data URIs. They look kind of like this, and they're awful, right? You've seen, how many of you have seen base 64 encoded data URIs that look like this? Oh, okay, not that many. So data URIs are a way to embed resources into your CSS. It could be PNG images, it could be SVGs, it could be anything. And most of the time they're used base 64 encoded like this, which gives you a huge string that makes no sense. Like, nobody can edit this. It's just random characters, basically. And you can use slashes to break it into multiple lines like this, but it's still not readable. Like, I can see that I have a circle here, but how is the circle created? How can I edit this circle? I don't know. However, that is not the only way to embed SVG in your CSS. You don't actually need to base 64 encode these data URIs. You can just paste the SVG markup in there, almost as it is. You have to escape the line endings if you want to have multiple lines. That's for every URL. If you want multiple lines, you have to escape the line breaks. And also, there are very, very few characters that you need to actually URL encode, like percent encode. We're going to see an example later on in this talk, but it's very, very few. Most characters can be used as is today. So in this case, We have a simple SVG with a coordinate system of 100 by 100, no dimensions, so it occupies the entire background positioning area. And all it contains is a red circle. And I can, because it's not encoded, I can actually change its variables by just editing the SVG in here. And because it's an image, I can treat it like any other image. For example, I can use background size on it. So the first thing we learn here is that you can have multi-line data URIs by escaping each line with a slash. And you can embed SVG in your CSS with these data URIs, and you don't need to percent encode most characters. It's actually going to be until pretty much the middle of the talk that we're going to see a character that needs escaping. However, you might be thinking, this is not a very useful background. What am I going to do with like a bunch of circles? I can do a bunch of circles with radial gradients. I don't know how many of you know this trick, but you can actually use gradients to make circles. However, this gives us access to the entire power of SVG. A circle is just an example. I could use a text element, for example. Let's put an A inside it. And notice that at first you couldn't see anything before I typed the Y. That's for two reasons. First off, the baseline by default is 0, which is at the very top of the SVG. So the entire character is outside the SVG. So you need to bring it down by specifying a baseline. And here I'm specifying a baseline of 1em. So you're already starting to see something. But it's very, very, very teeny tiny. So we can fix that by adding a font size. And note that even though I'm using CSS in here, in the style attribute, I don't actually have to specify 90 pixels. I can just specify 90, and it's relative to the view box. And in fact, any pixels I use inside my SVG are actually relative to the view box. They're not real pixels. So what can I do with an A? I can actually use any character I want. For example, I could use a unicorn emoji. Why not? And the good thing is that because SVG is markup and it supports a lot of what HTML can do, I can actually add a style element inside my SVG, which is inside my CSS. And what can I do with that style element? Why not add a keyframes animation with a transform that rotates what I have to -10 degrees. Now let's apply this animation. Let's make it a bit shorter and repeat infinitely, and also alternate to reverse it at the end. So now I can actually have a dancing unicorn as a background. Why not? Thank you. So, another set of takeaways is that you can use these data URIs to create images out of characters, and that way you could even create animated background. Who needs GIFs when you can have SVG? As long as you use CSS animations inside the embedded SVG. There's actually another way to do animations in SVG. It's not just CSS animations. We're going to see that towards the end of the talk, but I thought I would give you a spoiler there. Another useful use case of this technique is, for example, the big fancy quote on block quotes, which can be recreated by just having an SVG background. Yes, I know you can do it in CSS by using a pseudo element and complex positioning behind your element, but why do that when you can just use a background? And then you can have your pseudo elements free to do whatever other thing you want. Or you could have a star rating by just styling a meter. All my HTML consists of for this star rating widget is this meter element. And despite unlike most star rating widgets, which only display increments of 0.5, with this one, you can actually have any increment you want. Whoa, what? Okay. You could even have like any decimal number here, and it would still work. I'm not sure if you could see the difference, but it does. And you don't need to even restrict yourselves to stars. You can use any characters. But how does the actual CSS look like? Not very nice. So unfortunately, we had to use two different data URIs, and their only difference is this. So if we want to change the character we're using, for example, let's say instead of having a scale of stars, we could be rating chocolate ice cream. Why not? And you still get the same flexibility. But we need it twice, and actually in real life, we would need it more than twice, because for Firefox, as I say here, you have to use Moz meter bar, and Edge also needs a different one. But because this is a slide and we don't want to make it huge, let's just stick to this one. So some of you may be thinking, but Lea, I know we have CSS variables in CSS now natively. Why can't we do something like this? Wouldn't that be great? I mean, CSS variables do work like that. We can define any property we want as long as it starts with --, and then we can use it with the var function. It's kind of reasonable to expect that this should work, but it doesn't. So why doesn't this work? Two reasons. And none of these reasons are our fault. It's CSS's fault. So in CSS, we don't actually have concatenation. If we have two strings, there's no way to put them next to each other in CSS and create a new string. You might be thinking, but Lea, there's the content property, and I can put strings next to each other in the content property. Yes, but that's specific to the content property. It's not a general CSS-wide feature. You can only do that in the content property. Unfortunately, there's no way that works across the entirety of CSS to concatenate strings. And also, specifically when it comes to URL, there are special parsing rules to support unquoted URLs. URL is the oldest function in CSS. We had it pretty much since CSS 1. So back then, a lot of technical considerations were not really taken into account. When Håkon Vimli and Bert Bos designed the first version of CSS, they were like, you know what, we shouldn't require quotes in URLs. It would be easier if people can just use URLs without quotes. Unfortunately, that means that we need to have these special parsing rules that are still a burden until today. It means that everything you use inside the URL function has to be treated as a URL. If you use the var function inside the URL function, it's treated as a URL. It's not treated as a variable. This is unique to the URL function. There's no other function in CSS that has this problem. Every other function can accept variables just fine. The URL function cannot. Good news, we're going to solve this problem eventually by defining new functions. There's going to be a new function that does the same thing as URL but requires quotes, so it doesn't have this problem. We're not sure what to call it yet. There are multiple names that we are toying with. If you have suggestions, they're welcome. We're thinking maybe fetch, maybe location, maybe URI. We're still wondering. And also, we're going to come up with syntax to do string concatenation. Again, we're not sure about the name, maybe text, maybe concat. We're still debating it, but it's coming. In the meantime, if you want to statically reduce duplication, there is a solution. If you're using preprocessors like SAS or less, you can actually generate these URLs. When I wrote my book, I wrote it in HTML and CSS, and I had an entire SAS file full of functions to generate SVG data URIs. I had a function like inline SVG. This is a simplified version of it. It was a little more complicated. But it kind of looked like this. And I used it to generate these data URIs. And for example, if you want to create URIs for emojis like the ones we saw, you could also have an SVG emoji function. And if you do something like this, then the code we saw for the star rating would just look like that. And you could even use a variable for the star or whatever you want. There's many ways to reduce duplication if you're okay with using a preprocessor. Also, I mentioned that we can't use CSS variables inside URLs. However, we can assign an entire URL into a CSS variable, and that can still be useful. For example, here, I've specified a variable called snow, and I've assigned this data URI with the snowflake on it. And that means I can create multiple layers of snow without actually having to repeat the data URI. And I can just give them different parameters. For example, like this. And maybe let's give this one a little bit more offset, like that. Yeah. And what else can we do here? Just for the lulz, we can also animate them. Because why not? So we can use background position Y to animate it as much as the background size. The background size is 5 ems for the first one, 3 ems for the second one, and 10 ems for the third one. And now let's go here and assign it. Snowfall, it was called, let's say 3 seconds maybe. And let's make it infinite. And, there's this one thing about CSS animations, not related to SVG at all, but thought it's still useful to mention. Notice that by default, the way the animation progresses, it sort of like goes like this and stops, and then like this and stops. If you want a smooth progression with no easing, you can just say linear, and then it progresses linearly. And let's also make it move horizontally. Okay, and now that we've finished this, we can actually make it snow all over our slide. Because why not? And the good thing is, I can change the emoji I have here just once, and it changes everywhere. For example, now, what do I have? I have the emoji called man in business suit levitating. Yes, this is a real emoji, believe it or not. And it's falling from the sky. So what have I done here? It's raining men. And it's raining men all over my slide. Okay. So the next takeaway is that you can use CSS variables for the entire URL, even though you can't use them inside the URL to compose the URL. Another very, very useful thing. How many of you have used pseudo elements before or after to create custom list bullets? Almost everyone. Me too. It's one of the first things we do when we learn about pseudo elements, right? So here we have a list, and I've used list style image and set it to a data URI. And what does that mean? It means I can use a circle with, say, CX at 50, note what my view box is, CY at 50, and R, let's say, maybe 20. And now let's give it a fill of red. Now I have red bullets. I can give it another color. I can do whatever. Whoa, maybe blue. Or it doesn't even need to be a circle. Just like previously. Aha. It could be an emoji. Let's say we want a list with happy emojis. And we can control exactly where the bullets are placed. This gives us way more control than anything we can do in CSS for list bullets. And the best thing is, these are actually normal bullets, because I'm using list style image. So let's say if I have a lot of text, let's say like this, Now I have 2 lines of text. It works just fine. I don't have to use weird positioning stuff like in pseudo elements. It works just like a normal list bullet. And actually, I could even have different bullets depending on the list item. So let's say I want to have happy lists. And sad lists. Unfortunately, for the same reason we saw before, we have to repeat the emoji. But now I can have any combination I want. I can apply sad to any list item, and now I have a happy list, a list of happy things with the last thing being sad, or I can have a sad list with the last thing being happy, and so on. In fact, you've already seen a list like this in my slides. So not only I can use this to create custom list bullets, but I can also have custom list bullets per list item. This was an idea originally suggested by Amelia Bellamy-Royds. She does really cool things with SVG. So where else can we use these data URIs? Once you start using them, you start wondering, what else am I missing? We've used them in list bullets. We've used them as backgrounds. Can we use them as cursors? And yes, there are some use cases for that. You might be making a game or a map or some kind of widget that requires a custom cursor. And it's always better to use vector-based graphics, so you might be wondering, can we use SVG? So let's try to do that and see what happens. So let's add an emoji cursor. Same thing as before. Let's give it a 1em here and a font size, come on, a font size of say 90. And that was my first attempt, and it didn't work. I was wondering, why didn't it work? My data URI is fine. I've specified a fallback, just like the cursor property requires. Every time you use an image, you have to also specify a default fallback. I was puzzled. Why doesn't my cursor work? Maybe Chrome doesn't support SVG cursors, I thought at first. No. The reason it didn't work was that I didn't have a size. It requires an explicit size, let's say 100. And now it works. And actually, if you try this code in Firefox, it still won't work. Firefox also requires a width, a height as well, even though it's redundant. I don't know why. Yeah, I thought if you don't provide dimensions, then it will just be automatically sized, but nope. Another thing is, then I thought, you know what's better than a unicorn cursor? A huge unicorn cursor. But that's kind of anticlimactic. Suddenly my cursor just went back to where it was. That's because there's actually a strict limit of 128. Actually, I'm gonna remove the extraneous height. So this works. This does not. 129 doesn't work. 128 works. And there's the same, at first I thought it was platform dependent, but it turns out there's the same limit on Windows as well. Also, you probably can't see it on the projector, but on OS X, if I zoom in, you'll see that it's actually quite pixelated. That doesn't happen on Windows. That is only on OS X, but for some reason it's quite pixelated. It's like every pixel is blown up as a 2x2 pixels. And even worse, let's say I wanted to have an animated cursor. So you know the drill by now. I add the style element. I have my dance keyframes that go, you remember this from previously, right? And then I go here and I apply it as a style, animation, dance. Let's say 0.4 seconds, infinite, alternate. And then I expect to see a nice dancing unicorn cursor. But no, not quite. It sort of moves. It's not completely ignored, but it only moves when I'm moving my cursor. Now that I'm moving my cursor, it animates, and it sort of looks kind of funny. But if I stop moving my cursor, nothing happens. Apparently, Chrome only displays the animation when the cursor is actually redrawn, which happens when you move it. Firefox and Safari don't apply the animation at all. So Chrome's actually slightly better than the alternatives here. So to recap, the caveats with SVG cursors: they need explicit width and height. They are ignored if they're bigger than 128 pixels. They're weirdly pixelated in OS X. And animation is only supported in Chrome, and it's very wonky. There is a workaround, but only use the workaround if you really, really, really need to. It's awful. It's one of those things that you go and wash your hands after you use it. So there is a function called image set in CSS. It's a new function. It's not supported everywhere. Right now, it's only supported in Chrome and Safari, and only with a prefix, a WebKit prefix. What image set does is it lets you specify multiple sources for an image, similarly to the picture element in HTML. You know how the picture element allows you to have like this image for 1x, this image for 2x. So there is a function coming to CSS for this called image set. So if you use image set for the URL and 2x, and we specify 2x, and actually we need to add a prefix as well here. So now the pixelation is gone, but my cursor is obviously smaller because I've specified, essentially what I'm doing is I'm shrinking down the cursor. If I want to have the same size, I need to specify 256. And now 256 works because it's actually 128. And if I zoom in, you'll see that it's not pixelated anymore. It's actually how it should be in the first place. And that's not the most... I said earlier that this workaround is so awful that you need to wash your hands afterwards. That is not the awfulness. The awfulness is how you can use this workaround if you want to fix animation. And you can. So let's add this to a rule. And so the way you can use this workaround to fix animation in Chrome is a keyframes rule. Let's call it test, because I can't come up with a good name for this. And then, brace yourselves. I copy the cursor declaration and paste it in here and change this to something else like default. And then I apply the animation, let's say test, with a very, very small duration here, and make it infinite so that it actually repeats infinitely. And now I fixed the animation because I'm forcing Chrome to continuously redraw this. But it's awful, right? So unless you really, really need an animated cursor, just don't. Support for image set, like I mentioned, is only Chrome and Safari. Safari has unprefixed it, even though it's not standards compliant, its implementation. But Safari does support it without a prefix. Chrome needs a prefix still. And Firefox doesn't support image set at all. So another thing you can do with SVGs inside your HTML, inside your CSS, are fancy borders. Take a look at this border here. There's multiple things in this border that you can't do with CSS today. How many can you spot? So one thing is, we cannot have a dashed border with dashes like this. We get whatever dash width and gap width the browser decides is good, and that's it. We don't have any more control besides just using a dashed keyword in CSS. Also, we can't animate it in CSS. How would you animate a dashed border like this? We can't. And also, this border is not a solid color, it's a gradient. That's also something we can't do in CSS. All of these are things we can do with SVG strokes. For the first thing, which is animating the dashes and also having custom dashes, let's start from a rectangle. And notice that here, this is not a data URI, this is just an embedded SVG in my HTML. Once I finish, I'm going to copy it in a data URI, but it's often easier to work like this at first. So I just have a rectangle here with no fill and a black 4-pixel stroke. So one thing about SVG strokes, I can use stroke dash array, and then I can specify the width of each dash and the width of each gap. And I can actually have all sorts of patterns. I can keep providing numbers, it's not just 2. I can even do weird things like this, but why would we do that? So let's stick to that. So we already have something that we can't do with CSS borders, which is dashes that are twice as long as the gaps. And there is also a stroke dash offset property, which accepts a length and moves the dashed border based on that length. So notice that if I keep decrementing this, the border looks like it's animating, right? And if I have minus 30, it looks exactly the same as minus 15, which looks exactly the same as 0. And why is that? Because every 15 pixels, the effect repeats, because every 15 pixels I've covered one dash and one gap exactly. So I can take advantage of this and create an animation. Let's call it ants, because it kind of looks like marching ants. And I'm going to animate stroke dash offset to minus 15 pixels. And let's apply the animation here. 1 second, infinite. And again, we have this sort of moving and stopping and moving and stopping, so let's give it linear. And there we go. We already have the animating border. And how can we take advantage of this in our HTML? We can copy it and paste it in CSS. So here, we have a div with a class of unicorn, and I have the data URI ready here. So I can paste this in, escape the new lines, and there we go. So now we've essentially applied this SVG stroke onto our HTML element. And I can have whatever dimensions I want here, and it just adapts. Why does it adapt like this? Because the SVG, notice that the SVG here has no view box and no dimensions. And because it has no view box and no dimensions, it both stretches to accommodate the entire background positioning area, and also, because it has no view box, every pixel I specify in the SVG is an actual pixel. So what can we learn from that? No view box or dimensions lets your SVG background occupy the entire element. Stroke dash array lets you create custom dashed borders, like we saw. Stroke dash offset lets you move them, and is animatable. So we can animate this to create this sort of like marching ants effect, which can already be useful for things like selections. Like think on Photoshop or something like this. When you select something, the rectangle has this marching ants effect with the dashes that move like that. Another thing I mentioned is gradient borders. So SVG also allows you to have strokes which are not just a solid color, but are a gradient. The syntax to do gradients in SVG is a little unwieldy, because they came much earlier than CSS gradients. SVG had gradients pretty much since the beginning, since like 1998, Chris? Yeah. Whereas in CSS, we got gradients like 10 years later. So of course, we had more time to think of a better syntax. So in SVG, you do gradients with a linear gradient or radial gradient element. And you have to provide the stops as elements inside, and the colors as stop color attributes. And let's say one of them will be that, and the other one will be gold, for example. And we have to give the gradient an ID so we can use it. And let's go here and replace this solid color with a URL that points to this gradient. And notice that it's still a solid color. Why is that? Because we need to explicitly provide positions for the color stops, otherwise they're all at 0. So here both our color stops are at 0, so we have to specifically say that this one is at 1. And now we have an actual gradient. And what if we want a gradient that's diagonal? Well, then we have to explicitly provide the transform via the gradient transform attribute. And then we have to use a rotate here. And actually, this uses the SVG transform syntax, not the CSS transform syntax. And the SVG transform syntax is slightly different in subtle but annoying ways. Again, because SVG had transformed since 1998, and CSS got them a lot later. So it's a slightly different syntax. Namely, there are no units. If I provide degrees here, it just throws away the whole transform. So I have to say 45, just by itself. And now that I've created my stroke with a gradient, I can copy it into my data URI. And I escape the line endings just like before. And notice that even though I've escaped my line endings and pasted something that I know it worked in HTML, but it doesn't work in a data URI. Why? Can anybody guess why? It's a little tricky to spot. So notice here I have a hash. Hashes have special meaning in URLs. And this is essentially, it looks like SVG markup, but essentially the whole thing is a URL. And the hash has a special meaning. So what the browser sees here is that my URL ends at this point, and then I just have a hash. So if I want this to be, if I want my SVG to continue after that point, I need to URL escape this. And the other one. And now it works. It's not very impressive, though, because it overlaps with the text. It's starting to show that it's actually a background, even though we want to pretend it's a border. We can fix that with the padding. And now it behaves more like a border. And again, I can edit the text, I can make it multiple lines or whatever, and it still works. It's not affected by the aspect ratio of the HTML. So what characters do we need to escape? I've mentioned earlier that it's very few, and I've shown you that, for example, you need to escape the hash. Basically, you need to escape characters that have special meaning in URLs, and not even all of them. So you can see, this is the specification that defines how URLs work. And the gender limbs production is the characters that are actually essential for URLs. And as you know, not all of them are equally important. You can use brackets, you can use @ in your data URIs, and you don't need to escape them. I think you actually only need to escape the question mark, the hash, and slashes. And actually, when I started using this trick, you didn't even need to escape hashes at all. It was a change that Chrome made later. So, to recap, SVG supports gradient strokes, although syntax not very nice. You can apply those to HTML elements with data URIs, and you need to escape hash as %23 because it's a reserved character in URLs. And I mean, in some cases, you might want to use the hash in both ways. You might want to have a hash in your data URI that you escape, and a hash after your SVG that is actually a hash that refers to something inside the SVG. We're going to see an example of that later on. So another source of power for SVGs, major source of power, is filters. How many of you have used SVG filters? A few? How many of you can write SVG filters? It's okay. Only Chris that actually started SVG. Okay. Yeah, SVG filters can be a little tricky. I actually had huge trouble writing them. until very recently. But if you take the time to learn how they work, there's an excellent article by Sarah Sway done on that, by the way, they can be very rewarding. So I wanted to show you an effect with filters that you can use on HTML that I quite liked. So we define filters with the filter element, and we always have to give it an ID as well, so that we can reference it. And then we attach the filter to our element, which could be an SVG or an HTML element, actually, by using the filter function, the filter property. And notice that now, once I did that, my rectangle disappeared because my filter is empty. There's nothing in there. So of course it disappeared. I'm going to use two filters here. The first one's called FE turbulence, which its purpose is it creates a random texture of various colors, which is not very useful by itself, but it can be very useful when you combine it with other filters. And it has a bunch of parameters. You don't see anything yet because I haven't specified any of them. The first one is the frequency. And notice that once I specify a frequency, I already get something. It's not a very useful something, but like I said, this is not very useful by itself. It's primarily useful with other things. And I can also specify num octaves to say what is my actual range, how many times above the frequency it goes. You can see what happens with 0, nothing, not much. And then you can see what happens with different values. Above a certain point doesn't seem to make a difference. I'm going to use 3 here, or actually 2. And I think at this point we have something that we can work with. So what can we do with this texture? We're going to use it in conjunction as an input to another filter called FE displacement map. So what FE displacement map is, what does is a little tricky to wrap your head around at first, but it can be very useful. It takes 2 inputs. The first input is the image that will be manipulated, which in our case is our source graphic, the rectangle. And notice that once I did that, I got my rectangle back. But the second input is how are we going to displace that image? It's called displacement map for a reason. It shifts pixels on the first input based on the second input. And based on the second input, how? So here's the thing. The second input is an image, but it doesn't really use it as an image. It uses it essentially as a matrix of numbers. It takes each pixel on the second image, and it looks at the red channel, and it says, this is how much I'm going to shift horizontally. And it looks at the green channel, and it's like, this is how much I'm going to shift vertically. And the blue channel is just ignored. And I don't need to specify the second input because it's the previous filter by default. I do, however, need to specify scale, because by default it's 0, which means that both these red and green channels are multiplied by 0, so I see no shift, which is why you just see the rectangle back. But if I increase it, then you start seeing something. There's some displacement happening here. You don't see most of this displacement because it's outside the SVG and it's clipped. One way to display it is overflow visible. And what do we have now? We have a rectangle that looks like it's scribbled with like a pen or a pencil or something, which can be very useful when you're in designs like this with handwritten fonts, where you want to make everything look organic and hand-drawn. Unfortunately, overflow visible is not going to help you very much when you use this as a background, because it's not going to be visible. It's still going to be outside the background area. So we're going to use another technique to see what we have there. So we are going to offset the rectangle a bit by using X and Y. And then we need to make the width a bit and height a bit smaller. So we're going to use calc. And we're going to make the dimensions a bit smaller. And now we have our entire rectangle visible, and it will actually work with the background. There is one word here. The problem here is this will not work with Firefox. Firefox doesn't support calc and geometry attributes. So what can you do in Firefox to make this work? There is a way, but you won't like it. In Firefox, you actually have to draw the rectangle yourself with 4 lines and translate to move it. Which is kind of awful. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to pretend that Firefox doesn't exist. But you should know that you can do this, and it works in Firefox as well. It's not something that only works in Chrome and Safari. But let's go back to what we had. So that might be nice, but we actually wanted to apply it to our HTML content, not just create a rectangle. So you know the drill. We have our unicorn class here. I've already applied the handwritten font to it to sort of help the effect there. And I have to escape each line, just like before, just like usually. And then I have to escape the hashes. And there we are. Let's give it some padding to look nice. And there we are. We can actually even play with the parameters a bit to have something, to have a slightly different effect. It's up to you. So, what have we learned so far? Many things. You can use calc and geometry attributes, but not in Firefox. The FE turbulence filter creates a pseudo-random texture. If you go to MDN, you can actually read exactly how the texture is generated. There's a certain algorithm, but I didn't want to get into detail on that. FE displacement map shifts pixels around based on the pixel values of another image, and together they can be used to create a scribble effect. Now, what else can we do with this? How many of you have heard of squiggle vision? I didn't know what it was called either before I worked on this talk, honestly. But I'm sure you've seen the effect in cartoons. So squiggle vision is, first off, this headline does it, but it's more prominent here. It's when you have these cartoons where it's actually a static image, but it circles through many frames that are drawn separately, or at least they look like that, to create this sort of liveliness that you wouldn't get if it was just a static image. And that can sometimes be fun to do. So here we have our hand-drawn rectangle, but can we actually apply squiggle vision animation to it? So there is an attribute you can apply to FE turbulence called seed. And it seeds the random number generator that it uses. By default, it's 1, but it could be anything. And note that as I'm changing it, if I change it fast enough, you can see this, that I already have a squiggle vision effect, basically. All I need is to automate this, so I don't have to sit there and press my arrow key. But how could we animate seed? My first thought was to use CSS animations. Since geometry attributes are now properties and we can animate them with CSS, what if we could also animate attributes like seed? I'll spare you of that because it didn't work. The filter parameters are not CSS properties, so they cannot be animated. So how could we animate seed? We can use a different technology that pre-existed, that came before CSS animations, called Smile. Smile is supported everywhere. And it's actually more powerful than CSS animations, but more unwieldy, more repetitive, not as nice syntax. You're seeing a theme here, right? So you use Smile with by using an animate element, and you specify the duration, let's say 1 second, the attribute, which in this case is seed, the values it should go through, let's say 1 to 10. And notice that once I typed that, you already saw an animation there. But it only plays once. That's because we haven't specified a repeat count. And you might be tempted to say infinite, But that won't work, because it's actually, in Smile, it's a different, slightly different word, indefinite. And now it works, now we have squiggle vision. And can we use this on our thing here, on our HTML element here? Of course we can. So let's paste the element there, and there we have it. That is still an HTML element. I can still go in here and change it. I can still select the text and do whatever. It's just a normal HTML element. But now it has an animated border. Thank you. So you cannot animate filter parameters with CSS animations, but you can use Smile. And animating the seed attribute of an FE turbulence filter creates squiggle vision. And now I wanted to go even further. Notice that the stroke here is animated, but the text is not. If it was proper squiggle vision, the text should also have the same animation, right? So I thought, how could I animate the text? One way would be to put the text in my SVG and actually apply the filter to that. But text in SVG is kind of a painful affair. It doesn't wrap, it doesn't flow, it doesn't displace other things. It's a pain in the ass. So I actually wanted to apply this filter on my HTML content. So my first step was, okay, so I'm going to remove this background, for example, by putting an X in front of it so that it becomes another attribute. I'm going to apply a border, and then I'm going to apply the actual filter on my HTML element. So instead of having a background here, I'm going to use the filter property directly on my HTML content. I don't actually need the rectangle anymore, so I'm going to remove it. And then I'm going to use, so here I have a URL that just contains a filter. How can you use a filter from an SVG file? You just add a hash at the end. So what do you notice here? We sort of succeeded and sort of failed. The filter is applied. If I remove it, you'll see the difference. Filter, no filter. Filter, no filter. Filter, no filter. However, it's not animated anymore. Why is it not animated? I'm not sure. Chrome seems to disable animations, Smile animations, in filters that you link to. Probably for some obscure security reason, as usual. So can we do what we actually wanted? Yes, but it's ugly. It's becoming a theme at this point, right? So I can actually copy the SVG I had, and actually maybe I could copy it from previously. Nah. And I'm going to paste it in my HTML here. And I don't need to escape the line breaks here. So now I have this SVG right in my HTML. And I can go here and just use #scribble, because now it's local. And now it worked. Now it also applies, now it's animated and it applies to the whole thing. And notice that the SVG displaced the heading a bit. Even though it's not visible, it does have an effect, because SVGs with no dimensions by default are 300 by 150. But actually I can display none the SVG and I can still use the filter inside it. So there, I can do that. So what did we learn from that? If we use SVG filters on HTML content, if we do it by a data URI, then animation is disabled. But you can include the filter directly in your HTML to fix that. Ugly, but it works. And in case some of you noticed, that's actually what I was using in my cover slide. And I didn't have time for this today, but the circular text is also something you can do with SVG. So that's what I had for you today. I have stickers as well, if you want to come and ask for them. Thank you very much.